Outside of crime shows, it's no big secret that cops aren't really that great at their jobs. In fact, in wake of recent events, they are famously bad at their jobs, especially in terms of true crime. Things are bad now, but in 1897, investigative techniques were in their primitive stages in the West, despite Eastern countries having developed many forms of forensics even centuries before. One woman, Elva Zona Heaster Shue, decided in 1897 that the police were not adept at their jobs, essentially doing their job for them. The catch? Elva Zona Heaster Shue was already dead when she made this determination. Affectionately known as the Greenbrier Ghost, Elva is also known as the ghost who solved her own murder. Please consider subscribing if you're not already subscribed. Life in the 19th century was simple enough, though it was also a time of exponential technological advancements. It was at this time that West Virginia split from Virginia, citing views that plantations and enslavement were abominations. West Virginia vehemently supported Lincoln, and in this focused their lives inward. The land here wasn't particularly good for farming, thus only small farms existed with families owning and running the farms themselves. However, these farms were non-viable as thin soil and rocky terrain meant that nutrients would not remain in the soil regardless of how much crop rotation happened in the region. Because of this, the people of West Virginia turned to a more abundant resource available to them: coal. Traditionally, the state has had coal as a cornerstone to their economy, cycling between vast employment and inescapable unemployment. However, it wasn't until 1897, the same year in which Elva Zona Heaster Shue died, that the Great Coal Miners' Strike took place, over low wages given to the miners who were risking their lives to dig up coal. The strike would be successful, raising the miners' wages by September of that same year, the month before Zona's death. But why would this timing be important? Elva, who more commonly went by Zona, wasn't a miner, nor was her husband. But he would surely benefit from the miners' pay rise. Or maybe he would just benefit from his wife's death, as he wouldn't have to provide for her. When Zona met Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, he was a practiced blacksmith, making quite the living for himself working in someone's shop. It was October of 1896, and Erasmus was going by the name Edward. I would too if my name was Erasmus, let's be real. Seriously, who names their kid after an exchange year for a university student? Not too much of an account exists for Zona's meeting of Edward, but there's quite a bit of mention that the two were extraordinarily attractive. Perhaps their eyes met across a busy market, and Edward approached her, demanding to know her marriage status. Zona was immediately taken in by him, perhaps captivated by his handsome looks and smooth talk. The two began to court, presumably still in the honeymoon phase that comes with a new relationship. Zona's mother wasn't quite so taken by Edward, however. She didn't like the blacksmith in the slightest and forbade Zona from seeing him. This was likely due to the large age gap of 15 years between the two. Edward would have been 35 to 36, while Zona would have been 20 or 21 when the pair had met. Zona didn't listen, however, and the two eloped together only a month later. Zona was wearing the same burgundy dress that her husband would bury her in, her favourite dress. Maybe if Zona and her mother knew of Edward's past, she would have lived a long and happy life. At the age of 36, Edward was well experienced in marriage and death. At the age of 24, Edward would marry Ali Esteline Cutlip, who was freshly, hopefully, 18. She might have been 17 at the time. That age gap is still really weird, even for the time and place this happened. The pair soon had a child together. Perhaps struggling with the pressures of married life and child-rearing, Edward abandoned his wife and child. Ali would seek a divorce for this, but also later testified that Edward was a vicious domestic abuser and had beaten her often. His next wife would not escape him. In fact, she would die because of him. Lucy Ann Tritt would marry Edward at either 22 or 23, while he was 32 or 33. The creep clearly liked them young. It is not known whether or not the marriage was happy, but based on his previous marriage, it is entirely possible that he was also abusive to Lucy, though the two did not have any children. It isn't known whether or not Lucy may have been pregnant at the time of her death, but it may have been motivation, or he was just sick of her. You see, Lucy's death was ultimately ruled an accident based on Edward's account. Edward claimed that while repairing the roof of their home, he accidentally dropped a brick which just so happened to land on the head of his wife, crushing her skull and killing her instantly. Blah blah blah, patriarchal society, always believe the husband. No documentation shows any inquest or investigation into the death, but Edward was only starting his record of killing wives. Not to mention his prior conviction where he spent 2 years in penitentiary for stealing a horse. Just another mark on his still-forming criminal record. Lucy was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Whiting Cemetery, where she still remains to this day. Zona and Edward would only spend 4 months together as a couple, the last 3 of which they would be a married couple. There is no documentation on the couple's everyday life, nor are there any accounts of incidents good or bad. However, things would take a dark turn on January 23rd of 1897. Edward had left the house that morning as usual, heading to his workshop in town where he forged tools, screws, nails, bolts, and other household objects like candlesticks. After clocking in for the morning, Edward strolled to a nearby house. The family of this particular house had an 11-year-old son who would often do chores for Zona as she was still adjusting to married life and managing a house. The boy, Andy Jones, immediately accepted and began to make his way towards the house. What the child would witness would traumatize him. Upon making his way into the Shue home, Andy found Zona's crumpled and unmoving body. The boy, startled, ran home and back to his mother to tell her the horror he had witnessed. He then bravely took it upon himself to go to Edward's workplace and inform him of the death of his newly wedded bride. His exact statement is as follows. This also includes the morning leading up to the events. 4 times he came back to the house for me, each time I was busy. About 1 p.m. he came again and I agreed to run his errand. Going to the house, I felt that something was wrong. All of the doors were closed and there was an air about the place that I did not like. Reaching the steps, I saw a trail of blood. That scared me, but I went to the door and knocked. No one answered. I tried it and, finding the door unlocked, walked into the kitchen. The trail of blood continued across the floor into the dining room. This door, too, was closed. Once more I knocked and, getting no answer, walked in. I stumbled over Mrs. Shue's body. There she was, stretched out on the floor, looking right up at me, through wide-open eyes. She seemed to be laughing. I was frightened but still able to reach down and shake her. She was stiff and cold. Running from the house, I called across the field to Aunt Martha. Mrs. Shue was dead. Edward made a grand show of appearing in anguish before running to his home and scooping Zona into his arms. He directed for the local doctor and coroner, Dr. George W. Knapp, to be called. He kept hold of her even after the doctor arrived to pronounce a cause of death. But the image of a distraught husband holding his dead wife in his arms, as you may be imagining, is wrong. Edward paid special mind to hold her head in place to stop it from flopping about. He wanted to ensure that the coroner determined the death to be either accidental or natural. Andy would say the following of the events after finding Zona. As Aunt Martha ran to the house, I went down the road for Mr. Shue, finding him at the blacksmith shop with Charles Tapscott. When I told him what I had found, he let out a yell and, with Mr. Tapscott, started for the house. I continued on to get Dr. Knapp. When we reached the house, Shue had taken his wife from the floor, placed her on the bed, and was holding her head in his arms, crying for her to come back. But, strangest of all, although no one thought anything of it at the time, he had dressed Mrs. Shue, placing one of those old-fashioned, high-stiff collars around her neck and holding it in place with some kind of scarf. Dr. Knapp immediately started an investigation to determine if Mrs. Shue was still alive. Throughout his efforts to revive the woman, Shue continued to hold her head, refusing to let him examine it. Finally, the doctor turned and said, "It is an everlasting faint. Her heart has failed." The coroner respected Shue's wishes to not examine his wife further, allowing the man time to grieve and make funeral arrangements. If something struck the doctor as suspicious from this request, he did nothing about it and allowed Zona to be buried without further examination. Before this, Zona was laid out for her wake at her mother's home, an open casket viewing. Edward made a point of placing clothing and bedsheets either side of his deceased wife's head so that she would rest easier. He also stood suspiciously at the head of Zona's coffin for the entire duration of her viewing, almost like he was guarding her to ensure no one saw her neck or how unsteady it was. He guarded the top of her coffin until she was buried in a little cemetery atop a hill. Then the visitations began. Zona's mother Mary would lay in her bed at night crying in grief until exhaustion overcame her and she slept. Then the visitations began. Zona's mother Mary would lay in her bed at night crying in grief until exhaustion overcame her and she slept. She began to pray for hours at a time that God would answer her and explain why Zona had been taken from her. After these prayer sessions, Zona would appear to her mother. Maybe it would be wise to take Mary's words with a grain of salt as a grieving mother who already hated her daughter's husband. However, the accuracy in the statements given by Zona to Mary is uncanny. Supernatural, even. On the first night that Zona appeared to Mary, the woman was distraught and vengeful. The Greenbrier Ghost was almost incoherent, only managing to spot her that she had no meat cooked for supper, before the apparition vanished, leaving Mary bewildered. It was then that the woman knew there was something much more to Zona's premature death than just a random heart attack. On the second night, Zona once again appeared, this time much less upset and confused. The woman turned to her mother and told her something that would haunt her. In Mary's own words, "The second night she told me that her neck was squeezed off at the first joint, and it was just as she told me." Of course, at this point Mary was unaware of the truth behind these statements. She first put the visitations down to hallucinations caused by stress and bereavement. However, the third and fourth nights of visitations led Mary to brush off these hallucinations as her daughter's spirit begged and pleaded with her mother to seek justice for her wrongful death. She demanded that her mother tell on her murderer's husband. Zona, beyond the grave, asked her mother to set the record straight, that Edward had been cruel and abusive, that the day that she died, her husband had flown at her in a fit of rage, breaking her neck by strangling her with irate force. This convinced Mary to begin to seek justice for her daughter, confiding to those in her social circles that her daughter had visited her and told the woman that her death was not a heart attack but murder. Mary's friends were sympathetic, filled with sorrow for the woman so shaken by loss that she was having delusions. However, the woman's insistence and truthful tone would serve to win them over. Law enforcement had heard rumours, of course, but they shook their heads in compassion for the poor woman who was experiencing such a sudden loss. Mary and her brother-in-law Johnson took it upon themselves to visit with the prosecutor for Lewisburg and tell them of the visitation. John A. Preston, the prosecutor, didn't believe Mary's story when it was mere gossip in the town, but after hours of grueling investigation took it upon himself to reopen the investigation into Zona's death, questioning Mary on who in the town may have information about Zona's condition. She of course pointed him towards Dr. Knapp, who had pronounced Zona's cause of death. Dr. Knapp agreed that his prognosis may have been wrong, detailing how Edward had not allowed him to properly examine Zona and declined an autopsy. He also mentioned that he assumed this based upon her recent illness, the illness which is exactly why Andy was doing chores for her. Alarm bells rang for Preston, who immediately ordered an exhumation of Zona's body in order to examine her. An inquest jury was also summoned to aid in any legal case that may come from the autopsy being performed. The Greenbrier Independent detailed these events, reporting that Edward had vigorously complained that the exhumation was to take place. He was told to either attend the exhumation and inquest willingly or by force. Edward relented but stated that he knew he would be arrested, but they will not be able to prove that I did it. Clearly he knew that Zona had been murdered. The autopsy was performed over the course of 3 days and nights, and the aforementioned newspaper reported the following results. The discovery was made that the neck was broken and the windpipe mashed. On the throat there were marks of fingers indicating that she had been choken. The neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. The ligaments were torn and ruptured. The windpipe had been crushed at a point in front of the neck. There, of course, was some testing for poison due to Zona's prior sickness, which may have been attempted murder on Edward's part. No evidence of poison was found. Zona was returned to her grave to finally rest peacefully, and Edward was placed under arrest. He was kept on house arrest for 1 night, making his guards breakfast the next morning cheerfully before stating, "I'm ready to go to jail now." Thus, the trial began. While the prosecutor stated that the case was almost entirely circumstantial, he laid stress upon the fact that the dream testimony to be presented would prove beyond doubt to be authentic, and informed the jurors he could prove it. Dr. Knapp was called to the stand where he detailed the nature of Zona's neck injury, stating that her neck was dislocated and broken in such a way that there wasn't any possibility of the injury being caused by attempted suicide. He underlined that her cause of death had to have been from an external force, a vicious strangling. Then Mary took to the stand to talk about how her daughter's unrestful spirit had appeared to her, saying this about the final night, directly quoting Zona. He came that night from the shop and seemed angry. I told him supper was ready and he began to chide me because I had not prepared no meat. I replied there was plenty, bread and butter, applesauce, preserves, and other things that make a good supper. He flew into a rage, got up, and came toward me. When I raised up, he seized each side of my head with his hands and by a sudden wrench dislocated my neck. Edward then took the stand for an entire day, professing his innocence in the matter, not saying much else. After a discussion of all evidence, circumstantial and physical, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate on their verdict. After only 70 minutes, they came back with a unanimous verdict. Guilty. A spokesperson said the following. Taking the verdict of the jury as ascertaining the truth, we must conclude that Shue deliberately broke his wife's neck, probably with his strong hands, and with no other motive than to be rid of her so he might get another one more to his liking. Many in the community were livid, and so decided to form a lynch mob which would impose the same fate on him as his innocent wife. They intended to capture him from the jail the next Sunday and hang him, breaking his neck just how he'd broken Zona's. They gathered at 10 o'clock to enact their plan before being deterred. 2 days later, he was transferred to Mansville Penitentiary to serve the remainder of his life. He died there 8 years later from an unknown illness. Zona's murder to this day is often regarded as the only known case in which testimony from Ghost helped convict a murderer. This quote is immortalized on a highway marker in Lewisburg, standing to this day as Zona continues to rest, her spirit free and her murder solved, of her own accord. To this day, domestic violence is an extreme problem, which results in terrible trauma, injuries, and untimely deaths. For this reason, I ask you to visit the petition and charity in the description and show your support for the many victims who weren't and can't seek justice like Zona has. Thank you for watching.